21. Yeah, top of page 21. Let me comment on the opening verse of chapter 20, that is verse 1. I probably need to look at my translation again because there are a few things I've changed. I've tried to be as literal about translating the Greek text as possible, and what I should have rendered here is for the rule or the kingdom of the heavens. I have rendered it for God's rule. That's what we encounter in Mark's gospel. Basileia tou theou, the kingdom or the rule, reign of God. But Matthew is Jewish, so Matthew substitutes the Jewish formula, which in Hebrew is Malkut HaShamayim. Malkut is kingdom, and Shamayim is the plural of heavens. So Matthew has literally rendered that as Basileia ton uranon, the kingdom of the heavens, or the rule of the heavens. That's simply a Jewish way of talking about the same reality, and we'll have more to say about that throughout our session together. Okay, even we're ready to go.
You're ready.
So can I start?
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, let me read what I've translated, all right? For the rule of the heavens is like a housemaster who went out first thing in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the workers for a denarius per day, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out around 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, "You also go off into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is just." And they went off. He went out again at noon and at 3 o'clock and did the same. When he went out at 5 o'clock, he found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why have you been standing here the whole day idle?" They said to him, "Because no one hired us." He said to them, "You also go off into the vineyard." Now when evening came, the master of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the workers and pay their wage, beginning from the last right up to the first." Those who came at 5 o'clock received each a denarius. Those who had come first thought that they would receive more, and they also received a denarius. Those who had come first thought that they would receive more. But after taking it, they grumbled against the housemaster, saying, "These last people worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the heavy work of the day and the burning heat." Replying to one of them, he said, "Friend, I did you no injustice. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. I wish to give to the last as I also gave to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own possessions? Or is your eye evil because I am good?" And the last sentence of this is really Matthean. It repeats what was said at the end of chapter 19, and Matthew simply adds it to this parable because Matthew believes that this parable also illustrates what the story is all about. Which of these people do you identify with? Do you identify with the workers who were there for 12 hours and received what they originally had agreed with, a denarius? That's a good week's wage for that particular period of time. Or do you agree with the manager? When you hear this story, what's your response?
I would say that,
Do you take sides?
yeah.
You don't. You do.
I do. Because this doesn't seem just.
Yes. It doesn't seem just.
Right.
What do you think is the being or the state of being of these workers who complained about the one denarius that they originally had agreed with? What's their state of being? Number one question. Number two, what is the ideology that is informing their state of being? In other words, what is the system of values by which they make their protest? And that then defines the nature of their anthropology. You understand the question?
Maybe. It's a comparative thing. It's only in comparison that they feel that they were cheated. When they
But
sign
where
up,
are they coming from?
that
If they feel cheated, why do they feel cheated? What's up here? What's their sense of values that is evoking this kind of a response?
It's the world they live in and their sense of values. So they've adopted the world's sense of values and they're applying
Very
it.
good, very good. And Kate, could you narrow it down when you say world? What particular part of the world are they verbalizing? Just take a guess. What stratum of society would they be echoing?
They're on the bottom. They are the...
No, I'm not asking where they're located. What is the values that they're expressing while they are at the bottom of society? They are people who are selling their labor, so that puts them at the bottom of agrarian society. But they have values that is evoking within them this reality of unfairness.
that the harder and the more you work, the more you should get. I mean, you shouldn't be given the same thing that somebody that did 1/10 of the work gets.
Do you buy into that?
Pretty much.
So what is your state of being? What sense of values do you bring within you when you relate to the world and experience something like this?
Well, in the church, isn't that where people might be coming from when they say the more they do in the church, somehow the better their relationship is with God, and they make all those assumptions?
They have a sense of values that leads them to articulate this sort of thing.
Right.
And
They're missing grace. That's the aspect.
and say more about grace.
Well, that is to say...
How do you get it? Evidently, these workers don't have a sense of grace.
No. And they feel that they can earn their station in society. That is to say, we're all at the bottom. We're all trying to get a day's labor. We got there early. We got picked, and we agreed for something. But this householder is operating on a different set of values.
Exactly. And you might call it grace, but let's not get too
it's a
much.
messy term.
Let's not get too far into that, but we can bring that in a little bit later.
Okay.
But the real focus here are is specifically these workers who complain about the wage.
Yeah.
And the master says, is your eye evil because I am doing a good thing?
Yeah.
So
That's right.
the master is relating their sense of values to an evil eye. And the evil eye was very widespread through the world of antiquity, as it is in the East today. If you go to Turkey or Greece, places like that, you will encounter the evil eye and ways of warding off the evil eye that begin with childhood. All right, let's move on then and see what's going on here more specifically, and turn with me to the handout that I have given you on psyche and soma, soul and body. This page offers texts that differentiate these two anthropologies, okay? So I don't want to read all of them, but the top citations come from Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. And let's just drop down to the last one, 66DE. We must be free from the body and must behold the actual realities with the eye of the soul alone. For if pure knowledge is impossible while the body is with us, one of the two things must follow. Either it cannot be acquired at all, or only when we are dead. So the question is knowledge possible? And what quality of knowledge is possible? And while we live, we shall, I think, be nearest to knowledge when we avoid, so far as possible, intercourse and communion with the body, except what is absolutely necessary, and are not filled with its nature, but keep ourselves pure from it until God himself sets us free. And that, of course, will be the time of death. That's what I've tried to illustrate in the red over there, the separation between soul and body. And in Greek philosophy, the soul is represented by reason. In other words, what is not being used here is the a priori understanding that I talked about a moment ago, the understanding that we operate with throughout the day. What we've done in Greek philosophy is to turn our a priori understanding into reason, the power of reason, and we use reason to focus on whatever object we want to investigate. So there's separation. This is the hermeneutic in which biblical scholarship operates. And I've tried to describe that a little bit earlier in relation to this bottle of water. Now let's drop down below.
That's been from the beginning of biblical scholarship, right?
Well, when do you begin? When do you think biblical scholarship begins?
When they first started preaching on it, I imagine.
No, we're talking about scientific biblical scholarship, and that began with the Age of Enlightenment.
Okay.
It began around 1600, 1650. When we moved out of the Age of Enlightenment, a French philosopher by the name of René Descartes opened up this whole question of knowledge. How do we acquire knowledge? And he's the one then who differentiated soul and body in terms of a subject-object relationship in which the subject and object are separated from each other. But before that, oh, well, that's a big issue in and of itself. All kinds of interpretations were forthcoming for about 15 to 1600 years. And during that time, most interpreters of the Bible, whether they were preachers or Bible teachers, whatever, they were interpreting the Bible in relation to their a priori understanding. They were not scientifically directed. In other words, they were interpreting the Bible from the top of their heads, the way the fundamentalists do. But if they were influenced by a philosophy, they would interpret the Bible accordingly. So let's drop down to nephesh and basar. Those are the two Hebrew words. Nephesh is a word that biblical Old Testament scholars say usually refers to the throat, sometimes the gullet. It's this part of the anatomy that wants, that craves, like being hungry for food. And analogously, we hunger and crave for God. So Psalm 6, for example, heal me, O Yahweh, for my bones are shaking with terror. My nephesh also is struck with terror. And you, O Yahweh, how long? Return, Yahweh, deliver my nephesh, save me for your mercy's sake. Let's translate nephesh as soul. That's usually what is done. But it can also mean life. But life in a vital, essential self. And let's drop down to Psalm 16 because we have a differentiation here. I bless Yahweh who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I keep Yahweh always before me because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad and my nephesh rejoices. My basar also rests secure. Soul, flesh. There is no word for body in the Hebrew Scriptures. No word. We have to wait until 200 CE when the Jewish community codifies the oral tradition called the Mishnah. And that's where the word body creeps into the Hebrew language for the first time. Guf is the Hebrew word for body that arises around 200 CE. So, let's look at Psalm 31 because we do get something close to body there. Be gracious to me, Yahweh, for I am in distress. My eye wastes away from grief, my nephesh and my betin. Betin can mean womb, betin can mean abdomen or belly. That's about as close as we can get to body in Hebrew, but usually the word is basar, flesh. And finally, the one that's the classic, and I think we're all familiar with it, it's Psalm 42, 1 and 4a. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my nephesh longs for you, Yah Elohim. My nephesh thirsts for Elohim, for the living El, God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me, where is your Elohim? These things I remember as I pour out my nephesh. So there we have what is represented by the figure in green. And notice I encircle them in relation to each other. That's called a dialectical relationship. It's ongoing. All the time there's movement between the soul and the body because they are not separated from each other. If you have one, you have the other. That's not in Greek anthropology. You can't, in Hebrew anthropology, you cannot have the soul without the body and the body without the soul. So here's a statement that needs to be said so that the church may finally come around and correcting itself, because the church usually embraces Greek anthropology and not Hebrew anthropology. In Greek anthropology, the soul is in the body. Somewhere it's in here. The soul is in the body, and at the point of death, a separation takes place. But we don't allow them to get too close to each other because they will interfere with the quest for knowledge. In Hebrew anthropology, the soul exists as a body. The soul exists as a body. They are intimately related to each other. You cannot separate them. The self is a both and always.
So what happens after death for a Hebrew viewpoint?
Do you read the New Testament?
Mhm.
That's a foolish question, isn't it? Have you read the story of Jesus' resurrection?
Yeah.
What happens? What do you think happened at Jesus' resurrection?
Well, he was raised as a body, but then he was raised again to heaven.
When the women, in Matthew, 2 women visit the tomb, what do they find?
Grave clothes, nothing else.
Say it louder.
Grave clothes,
And Jesus?
no.
Why didn't they find a body?
Because the physical body was raised.
Very good. You're into Hebrew anthropology, whether you know it or not.
Okay.
In other words, the church interprets the Easter event in terms of Greek anthropology. In other words, somehow the body was there, but in Hebrew anthropology, the body cannot be there because the two are one. The soul and the body are one. And because they are one, if there has to be a resurrection, it's not a separation of soul and body, it's a both and raising from the dead. All is clear?
No, that
Well,
just
ask
raised a bunch of
You've got to
questions.
ask some questions. That's what I'm here
Alright.
for. So pursue it.
All right,
Keep
so,
pushing hard.
okay, so then in Hebrew anthropology, when you're dead, you're waiting for that final resurrection when Christ returns and
Not bad.
And-
Not bad.
everybody is raised up.
But pretty good. Where'd you learn that?
I don't know, reading the Bible.
Well, let me show you a text where that, in fact, is directly stated. If you have a Bible, turn with me, if you want to 2 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 5.
Okay.
Paul is writing the Corinthians. They are Greeks. And of course, they presuppose Greek anthropology. And Greek anthropology, as we've seen from Plato's Phaedo, separates the soul from the body. So the soul, at the point of death, goes off into eternity somewhere, but the body decays in the ground. And Paul wants to correct the Greek understanding for these Corinthian Christians. So this is what he says. 2 Corinthians 5:1. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, that's the fleshly body, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Another body. For in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. If indeed, when we have taken it off, we will not be found naked. In other words, it's so vital to our nature to have soul and body together all the time that we want to have the two always, even when we move out of this life into the next life. But Paul's trying to tell the Corinthians that maybe if they want to maintain their Greek anthropology, this is at least one change they have to make, that maybe for a period of time after death, the soul will be naked, waiting for its heavenly tent, waiting for its heavenly building, a body. So he's going to say, for while we are still in this tent, we groan under our burden, because we wish not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed. In other words, we always want to be clothed because we are necessarily a soul and a body, not an either or, but a both and. God, who has prepared us for this very thing, has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So there you have some validation of this Hebrew anthropology in the New Testament, particularly in the writings of Paul, who is dealing with Gentiles who basically buy into Greek anthropology. And it's sad that the church never paid much attention to this particular verse. So, any questions? We want to move on now. We'll be saying more about Hebrew anthropology in conjunction with the entire gospel according to Matthew. But let me make one necessary observation so there's no misunderstanding. I do not reject Greek anthropology. It's necessary. It's the basis of science. It's the basis of scientific investigation. We need that kind of anthropology. But what I'm maintaining here is a both-and anthropology. In other words, the Greek anthropology has its specific objectives. Hebrew anthropology has its objectives, and I would argue that of the two, the Hebrew anthropology is more natural and more human. So, turn, if you will, to Matthew 1. Either my translation or your text or both and. And we're going to spend some time on chapter 1 because it is the essence. It as an essence of the book, it determines what is going to follow all the way to the end. In other words, if we don't understand Matthew 1, which I, as you see, I guess I don't use the word here. It's